Welcome to Sundays with Jane Eyre, or should I start the show? Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today because this is the wedding chapter, episode 19, Impediment, covering volume 2, chapter 11, or chapter 26 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I'm Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, and joining me today as guest co-host is Dr. Claire O'Callaghan. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Ed. Hi, everybody, or airheads, which is probably the best word I've heard in a long time.
Brontosaurs,
yeah.
Airheads.
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here.
Good. You ready for the wedding chapter today?
I am so excited about this chapter. I was saying to you, of all the chapters in the book, how this would be the dream one to get, and I'm so excited to be talking about this.
Excellent. I even have this is like one of my nice pipes with a silver band for the wedding.
Yeah, we should have come with hats. We should have come with wedding hats, shouldn't we?
I could put on my top hat and do that. But yeah. Well, I've worn that in shows too. So
brilliant.
Well, welcome to all of you erudite Brontosaurs and airheads out there. If you're new to the show, just a note in our format: if you're watching live on Zoom, the chat's for you to talk to each other. But if you have a question today for Claire or myself, put it in the Q&A and we'll do our best to hit as many of them as possible. We're also streaming live on YouTube. And if you're watching there, then if you leave a comment or a question in the comments there, I'll get to it after the show. And I encourage everyone to check out the YouTube video of this and like and subscribe to the channel and do all that stuff to make the show even bigger. Dr. Claire O'Callaghan is a lecturer in English at Loughborough University in the UK. Her research focuses on Victorian and neo-Victorian literature and culture with an emphasis on gender, sexuality, and the body. She is the author of Emily Brontë Reappraised, and you're the final Sarabande author we've had there because we've already had Sophie Franklin and Adele Hayes on. She has also written on Jane Eyre, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Emily's poetry, contemporary reworkings of Wuthering Heights, and the Brontë biodrama To Walk Invisible. She is now also the associate editor of Brontë Studies. And Claire's current research is looking at Charlotte Bronte's commentary on her siblings' experiences of tuberculosis in 1848. Wow, you've got the Brontë resume here for us.
I've got the Brontë bug, I think, is what that says. I just can't get enough of them. So yeah.
How did you get there? How did you get to, the 19th century? I mean, how did that become the thing you were going to do? And also the Brontes, but how did you get there to begin with?
To be honest, it was from reading as a kid and just absorbing Victorian literature. I learned pretty quickly that I wasn't a fan of earlier periods, and I just always loved getting lost in those big, lovely novels and the rich descriptions and getting carried away with it. And I came to the Brontes after I left school and was going on to A-level, so to college before university here. And I was given a list of, it was called summer reading, but it was 2 sides. It was quite a lot of reading. It was all 19th century literature. So I started at the top, which was the Brontes. And it just began from there. That was like the real kind of passion. So started with Jane Eyre and worked my way through.
So you didn't read the Brontes when you were younger, but you were reading other Victorians. What else were you reading?
Yeah, I was obsessed with Oscar Wilde. I got into Dorian Gray and Bram Stoker, all that kind of 1890s Gothic stuff. I was really taken with that. Still am, of course. But I think probably like so many of your guests and yourself, that there's something about the Brontes that if you get the Brontë bug, it doesn't go away. So I ended up going there, and I still go back all the time to the Brontes. So,
what's your Jane Eyre story? Do you have one? I mean, what was that like reading the first time?
So as I was saying, I got this summer reading list, and I was never going to cover everything from this reading list in one summer. It was kind of intimidating, but it was to start with Jane Eyre. So my dad took me to the library and we got a copy of Jane Eyre and brought it home, and I read it over the course of about a week, and I absolutely loved it. What I loved the most about it was, apart from the kind of Gothic sensationalism, particularly when we get to this point in the book, but I really, really liked that strong child voice from the beginning, that kind of ardent young woman, which I hadn't really seen in other Victorian literature. There was always adults kind of doing things and talking, but having that young female character. So that really, really took me. And young female rebellious character too. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's really, I resisted all the way.
You really don't find that.
Yeah.
Most novels at that time.
And it's weird. When I reread that kind of those early parts of this book now, I kind of think, God, did I really understand everything that was going on at the time when I first read it? So, but it stuck with me. And so Jane Eyre, that was my first experience of Jane Eyre, and I loved it so much that I couldn't wait to then get to the other Brontë texts. And I did that thing of, rather than going to read any more of Charlotte, I went straight to Wuthering Heights at that point. Mm-hmm. I think I thought it was going to be exactly the same thing, but it's so very different in so many ways that it was not what I was expecting at all. So I was kind of lucky that I had that kind of experience in them all, quite in unison, really, in lots of ways. So yeah, that's my. It's not the most compelling Jane Eyre story.
No, but it's it's some of it, we come to it at different times, and I'm fascinated that no matter the age you come to it, it can still really grab you and keep you, and you just want more and more and more of this.
Yeah.
How did the Emily Brontë Reappraised book came out? This was also released on the 200th anniversary of her birth that year. How did you come about to write that for Saraband?
So, I before I worked at Loughborough, I used to teach in another university, and I ran a course on the Brontes, which is my favourite thing. It was just an absolute joy, and we'd have kind of students from all over the world coming to do this course, and inevitably, what I was discovering was they read the books, they knew the novels, they were less familiar with some of the poetry, and they knew a little bit about biography, but it was kind of like top level stuff, i.e. they lived in Haworth. So I was already thinking about wanting to write some kind of accessible introductory material that was a bit more biographical in nature. And it so happened that in 2016, when Sophie's fantastic book on Charlotte came out, I thought, that's it. That's the kind of book. It's fresh, it's friendly, it's accessible. It has that, if you're a fan, you're going to enjoy this. And it just gave that kind of digest. So I was, I basically contacted Saraband and said, this is what I'd like to do. Can you give me the gig? And Sarah from Saraband was like, write me out what you would do and how you'd approach it. And they said, yeah, they'd commission me. So it was terrifying then, because I had a period of time that I now was like, oh, it's now the bicentenaries. I've got to do this.
Yeah.
And I was,
can't put that one on. You can't procrastinate on that. It's like, there is a hard deadline. That's what it's for.
Yeah. What was, I guess the thing was, though, because I initially had approached it thinking I was going to write just solely for my students, I didn't expect that it was going to be also wider Brontë fans who would also then have that appetite to read more biographies, because there were already lots of biographies about all of them, but there hadn't been one on Emily for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So I kind of I wrote it primarily for this kind of newbies to the Brontës, really, who maybe didn't know too much. And then, naively discovered, or in my naivety discovered, that actually, if people love the Brontës, they're going to read all the biographies, and every time a new one comes out. So I suddenly, when the book came out, and it was great, and it came out in the bicentenary year, and it was such a privilege, but that people who were so passionate and who had their own stories and wanted to come and talk to me about Emily and the detail of her life and all those things, it was I hadn't prepared for any of that. So It was great. It was absolutely wonderful, complete learning curve. And what's exciting is actually it's about to be released in America later in the year. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm really excited about that.
Yeah. And then, well, there's just more ways we could buy. I mean, we could buy anything in the world anyway. I mean,
oh, well, yeah, of course. You're going to have a proper edition just for the US.
Good. So that idea too, that it's also a reappraisal, that it's also, this is a very up-to-date, you're a working, scholar and newish scholar in the last, decade or so, really putting this kind of thing together. That's one of the things that I find so interesting about these books too, is that, like, whenever I go to find or discover, especially when I'm discovering something new, I'm always a little reluctant, like, oh, well, you know, and I read critical work on it that's, you know, 50 years old already.
Yeah.
You know, how much does that really apply to today?
Yeah. Well, one of the things with this that I was really keen to do was, I think someone, particularly Emily, and all of the Brontes, but particularly Emily, there were so many myths about her. There are so many wild and wacky ideas, as much as kind of sane ideas about her. And I think if you're new to Emily, how do you wade through that? How do you actually make sense of, you know, did she really beat up her dog? Did she really do this thing? You know, did she really never speak to anybody in the town? And I'd seen, what I'd increasingly seen was just that the way that those ideas kind of grew into a life of their own, and they were becoming a kind of shorthand. And I wanted to really go back and think about, well, actually, what else can we learn about this author when we kind of move beyond the mythic and move beyond some of the speculation and things that people have written. So I was trying to get a sense of, who is this woman from her writing, and what do we actually know about her that's not, you know, 2 and 2 is 5 kind of, approach. So I tried to take on different things, you know, taking on this idea, you know, I think Emily has been talked about as having pretty much every disease under the sun, you know, been diagnosed with all kinds of mental health issues, with all kinds of various issues. And, you know, how much of that is actually true? Those are the kind of questions that I'm kind of thinking about. And that's where that idea of let's reappraise all of this kind of comes from. Good. Yeah. And I hadn't planned on asking this, but I am now, because of the Brontë biodrama that it was a BBC, it wasn't Sky. No, it was BBC. Yeah, BBC and PBS, I think. To Walk Invisible. And you've written on that. How do you think that captured, you know, how we view them now? And is it a different thing? I mean, I think it is. And how is it a different portrayal of the Brontë sisters? I think what was really interesting about that is the way in which Branwell is given, you know, so central to the story, and not, I mean, it's obviously very much focused on those last few years and the addiction and the decline. But what you see is a kind of, not just this idea that Branwell is this kind of, you know, write-off that he was, you know, a drunkard and that's all he's remembered for. You see the complexity of what it meant to maybe live with somebody who was really suffering. And you see the different sisters struggling with that alongside this kind of development of their literary career. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was a really, really great drama. I mean, I was the piece that I've co-written on that was very much thinking about what are the myths that have been associated with Branwell and addiction and mental health in this drama? How does it challenge them, or how does it sometimes reinforce them? And I think that's the thing. Again, when, you know, that came out in 2016 at Christmas over here, there was such an appetite for it. Yeah. And to come out just before Branwell's bicentenary, I think was really important to, again, think a bit about him as more than just a drunk, which is he's often belaboured, to think about him as a writer, to think about his relationship with his sisters. I mean, there's some great tender moments in that of him with Emily, for example. They're sat on a bed, on a kind of gate at one point, howling at the moon and that kind of stuff. You see her caring for him and kind of nursing him, which again gives a different side to her and their relationship, other than this idea that she was very cold and he was just, you know, this kind of danger in the household. So I really like what Sally Rainbow. The myth is Charlotte and Branwell are together, and Emily and Anne are kind of more linked, but this really shows, and Branwell's so central to their lives and almost everything they do, and it's not because they need him, he just is. He's the center of that family. Absolutely. And Adam Negatis does such a brilliant job of portraying him in that. I mean, he's kind of visceral in how he conveys Branwell's passions and his emotions and the intensity of what was going on at that time. And of course, you see that how they're all working with their father as well. Yeah. How they've all got different responses to what's going on. It must have been such a tough time for them all. We did a watch party for that the summer after it came out at the Rosenbach. So we had a bunch of people in that summer and we watched it, and it was a lot of fun. Were people crying? Because it's very emotional at times. It is. Yeah. Yeah. So there may have been. I don't know. I didn't. You know. And that's the thing. I love. So if I show that to students, I normally make sure I sit where I can see them, and you see people with the kind of tissues trying not to cry, because it's really powerful in places. Somebody in the chat here, Adam, was there. Yeah, Adam, did you remember if anybody was crying? And to see if you throw that in the chat there. Maybe Adam was.
The piece that you wrote for that, then, is that available, or is that in a journal?
It's coming out in a book that's coming out later this year, but I can send a link to the version that's the kind of publication format that's on my staff page, so I can certainly send that and people can read it. That's if people want to get in touch, it'd be great to hear people's views on it as well. Good.
All righty. We can do that on our Facebook page too, have people talking about that. All right. Are you ready for the wedding chapter?
I'm so ready for the wedding chapter.
Ready for the wedding today? Who will catch the bouquet?
I feel like we have by getting to talk about this chapter.
Yeah. Well, in real life, Adele would have been there waiting for that bouquet. That would have been all hers. Nobody else get near the bouquet. Adele would have really knocked people aside to get it. So
yeah.
All righty. Last week, in the previous chapter was when Jane was, and let me get your commentary on this, because Jane tells Rochester about not one but count them 2 nightmares she has in the same night, right before her marriage. So she's clearly going through a lot of anxiety, but also this weird, strange, scary woman in her room at night and tears her wedding veil in half. Rochester's response is, of course, like, that's a shame, sleep in another room the night before the wedding. But Jane doesn't sleep at all. How do you thoughts on those nightmares that Jane has holding the child and Rochester far away on the path?
There's so much richness, isn't there? She's clear. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting we were talking about rereading this book, your second or third reading of this book, when you've got all the pieces and you can put the jigsaw together. She clearly is picking up on so many things. But of course, the idea that she's had the dream with this, figure standing over her and all this stuff with the veil. One of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about with all of that is how much of that kind of Bertha, running around the halls and doing all that stuff, is she kind of warning Jane rather than coming to scare her? Because and we'll get to it, of course, in this chapter when we see that character for the first time and she sees Rochester. She's clearly triggered by him, but she's not violent towards Jane. It's Charlotte doing great setup, isn't it? Foreshadowing and all that tension, that psychological richness that's kind of going on there.
The psychological richness you and I were talking about is just there's so much psychological complexity in this, so much examining, the psyche, especially of the first person narrator, that's in some ways very groundbreaking for a novel like this, for this novel, and especially for a novel about a woman, I think, in 1847.
Yeah. I mean, Charlotte was really interested in psychology, and she was reading medical writing at the time. I mean, that's one of the things that she did in thinking about Bertha, which obviously is going to take up the next few chapters. But, she was schooling herself in kind of 19th century medical writing, the latest 19th century medical writing. So she was obviously interested in trying to get it right to the understandings of the day, at least. And I think one of the things she does really well here in that last chapter, but in this one as well, is it's not just the fact that Bertha, the lunatic, is in the room. It's all that stuff that's going on with Jane and how she's dealing or not dealing with the events that are folded, but more so Rochester. For me, rereading these last few chapters, and you were saying, and he's like, just sleep in another room. He knows, and he's in denial. The levels of denial are just incredible, actually. That's what I think is really interesting when you reread this and that he has that knowledge, and it's really sad, actually.
He also has that moment after Jane tells the story that, and this is why I tell her to sleep in the room. He has that moment realizing, oh no, you're actually in danger. And he had never thought, he's just so cavalier about the danger that anyone in the building faces, even though Mason is almost murdered. He's so cavalier about it. And it's a moment of him realizing too that, but he's getting out. He's like, we're married tomorrow and we're out of here.
That's why he wants to go on that honeymoon straight away, doesn't he? Get her out of danger and get himself out of danger, really.
Well, let's get to this then. The end of chapter 25, Jane says, talking about Adele, I remember I kissed her as I loosened her hands from my neck. I cried over her with strange emotion and quitted her because I feared my sobs would break her still sound repose. She seemed the emblem of my past life, and he, Rochester, I was now to array myself to meet the dread but adored type of my unknown future day. So it's not all rainbows and sunshine for Jane, entering in, to her marriage. And she knows that, she knows that there's some mysterious thing she doesn't know what it is, not only about the house, but about him. She could tell he's always upset about something, but he never admits to it.
We've had this incremental build-up, haven't we, in these chapters all along, all these strange events and happening, and with Grace Poole and with the fires earlier on, and what's going on. Her gut is telling her, and I think even a lot of the way through this chapter, her gut is kind of screaming at her, really. This is not going to go well. This is it's not going to be what you think.
Premonitions she has all the time about this. Okay, so here we are. It's the end of volume 2, chapter 11, or chapter 26. And almost all editions now just have the continuous chapters. But for the very first readers of this, it's a 3-volume, it's a triple-decker novel, and she's designed it very well. Her endpoint for volume 1, and now her endpoint for volume 2 in this chapter. For people, that it's not quite a cliffhanger, but it's a big revelation, and you absolutely. I must go on to the next volume now, because that's a real thing for readers in the 19th. I mean, if there are people who like, if they start a book, they have to finish it, and I think that kind of feeling is always there. But if it's in distinct volumes and you finish one and you don't feel like going on, it's a lot easier to quit it. And I think Charlotte makes sure we don't quit this volume.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're all there. We're all knowing something's about to happen, and now it's for what is going to happen on this wedding day.
Here it is. Sophie. Sophie came at 7 to dress me. Rochester is impatient. Sent up like, "Where are you?" And then she has to put her veil on, and then she says it's the plain square of blonde after all. Because the other one is torn, so she wears the very much simpler veil that she wanted to wear. And just to remind people, I think I mentioned this before, that the veil was not worn over the face at this time for weddings, so it's just on top of the head, so her face is still there. And she will look at herself in the mirror here, and she sees I saw a robed and veiled figure. She wasn't even going to look at herself. It says that. I know. Like, the maid, is it Sophie? The maid stops her, the French maid, and she's like, no, you've got to
look at yourself.
And she says, I saw a robed and veiled figure so unlike my usual self that it seemed almost the image of a stranger.
This reminded me, when I was rereading this reminded me of those early chapters, chapter 2, when she goes into the red room and there's a looking glass there and she thinks she sees things, doesn't she? And again, you kind of wonder to what extent Jane's carried this kind of, complexity with looking glasses, with mirrors, throughout her life. For me, it's. I'm sorry, you were. No, come. Well, for me, it was, who was the last person to put a veil on and look in that very same mirror? And it was Bertha. So that Jane saw in the night, and that she also sees a robed, veiled, stranger in the mirror. We'll continue this because there are all kinds of links between Jane and Bertha all through. This chapter. She finally comes down. Rochester's on fire with him. My brain is on fire with impatience. And then he's like, you got 10 minutes to eat breakfast. And then we're out of here. I mean, at this point, this is not already going great. If you haven't, I know it's custom to often be late for your wedding type thing, but to be given 10 minutes to have some breakfast is a bit harsh on his part, I think. And he's checking that everything's ready. Luggage. Go check the church, carriage all ready, and then he lets him know, like, it's got to be ready the moment we return. We're like coachman in his seat. When we're back from the wedding, we're hitting the road. I like what he says to her when she says, so he takes her to the dining room and then says, surveyed me keenly all over, pronounced me fair as a lily, and not only the pride of his life, but the desire of his eyes. There's a real, that use of desire there is really suggestive, isn't it? It's loving, but it's also, if this all goes through, this will be a different relationship by the end of this day. So he can be kind of more confident in the way he's speaking to her there. And it's still always, she's not Jane to him, even in that moment. She's a lily, and
and it's always this, we've talked about this in other episodes, or at least I have, this Rochester is the one that sees the fairy tale world life. He's in a fairy tale himself.
Yeah.
And that fantasy that he keeps trying to put forward. But Jane's not like that. So.
Yeah. And of course, that idea that he calls her fair at this point is again, that's picking up on the descriptions that we're going to get later, isn't it? And contrasts with the nightmarish visions that she's had in the previous dreams, which I think is also, bringing out that innocence, isn't it, as much as anything else.
And we know too, the reason he's in such a rush here is he needs to escape this house. He needs to escape, his past life. He needs to escape his wife who's up there. And this is the end game. And now I get to have everything I wanted and not have to deal with from the mistake that I made before. And now just flee his past.
That's one of the things that's really interesting about Rochester. If you kind of start to think about his behavior, anytime there's difficulty, he does go into flight mode. He does. He left. After those initial years of marriage, he left and came back to England. He then leaves, as we'll discover, what he does with his wife and goes off to Europe. And now, of course, he wants to just get that wedding done and flight again because he can't face the stuff. So again, kind of draws out that, Charlotte is kind of really on point with that fight or flight thing going on there.
Even after the first moment where Jane and he start to kind of realize they're attracted to each other, that's when he leaves to go, the next day she wakes up and he's gone and he's off, visiting people, and then returns with the whole Blanchard and the whole crew. But even in that moment, he flees as soon as something serious happens. He's not great with emotions. We know this. This is one of his things. He really doesn't deal with them well. And I think it's all been set up for us that we'll see this kind of unfold here. Mm-hmm. Well, the Jane lets us know what kind of wedding this is. There's no groomsmaids, there's no bridesmaids, there's no routes, there's no flower. Poor Adele didn't get to be the flower girl. The role she was made for, the flower girl. The none but Mr. Rochester and I like that that phrase there. And he, though, has her hand. My hand was held by a grasp of iron. I was hurried along by a stride I could hardly follow. And his face. Yeah, I have to read that. His face. I wonder what. Can you read that?
I wonder what other bridegroom ever looked as he did, so bent up to a purpose, so grimly resolute, or who under such steadfast brows ever revealed such flaming and flashing eyes. He's stressed, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's marching and he's stressed, actually.
And dragging her along in this, heavy grip of iron. And Jane recognizes it, though. So she's not naive here. She knows that there's something going on, but she just doesn't know what it is. Why is he so, vehement?
She can see it. Yeah, she can see it on his countenance, but she can't understand it. It's the first time Charlotte begins here. She constantly throughout this chapter associates him, even though there's this rich, complex, this inner turmoil going on. Jane often describes him in relation to kind of natural materials, so iron, and we're going to get marbled quarry and all those things later. So it's interesting she's using those motifs.
And then I know not whether the day was fair or foul. Really, a Macbeth reference on your wedding day? I'm not sure. Talk about presentiments. That this is and not one but two Macbeth references in the same paragraph, because then it's there again. Right? I wanted to see the invisible thing on which, as he went along, he appeared to fasten a glance fierce and fell. That's the Macbeth, the dagger of the mind. That's what, and following this invisible dagger and if that's how you think he looks. You have to say, has she read Macbeth by this point, Jane? Making her own references. Hold on here. Yes, of course, because this is Jane looking back and recounting the scene. So in a sense too, but
which begs the question: is that her? That I know not whether the day was fair or foul. Is that is that Jane reading the weather on the day, or is that Jane looking back? And I can't quite remember the weather because of what was kind of going on, although she does give us some later.
That's interesting because then that really does make it a from the future comment, and they don't happen all that frequently where you really get this is mean. I mean, of course we get all the reader addressing the reader kind of thing, but the perspective of Jane, I forget how many years after, 10 years after or something, that you don't get, we get that occasionally, but you really got to look for it to find it there. And that then must be one of those moments that, in looking back on it, it's it's all Macbeth.
In a way, if you think about it, this whole book is structured around 2 significant days of trauma. It begins with the no possibility of a walk that day, and she starts at that moment. That's obviously so formative. But here it's, really this could have begun, there was no possibility of a wedding that day, but she doesn't frame it like that. But it's exactly the second traumatic day for her, isn't it? So I wonder whether, again, that's Charlotte writing, kind of trying to imagine that trauma of the difficulty of remembering details in trauma in some ways.
And for the first time this morning, he pays attention to her. Am I cruel in my love? He said, delay an instant, lean on me, Jane. Like, you finally realize that, like, I've just been dragging you along here. I like
the fact that he poses it as a question. Again, it's a kind of in denial. He knows that he has been marching her to the church. But at least he says, lean on me, Jane. I mean, that's quite nice.
That's what he thinks he's doing.
Yeah. This is not nice, really.
He thinks he's supporting her, but he's really dragging her along.
Basically.
And Jane, and then Jane sees out. Of course, there's the green grave mounds, another thing. I'm not so sure it's the best thing to be thinking about on your wedding day. But she sees the 2 figures of strangers straying amongst the low hillocks. Very kind of spooky, very in a kind of supernatural kind of way, these 2 figures out among the waves.
I was reminded when I was reading this, it struck me, it reminded me of the end of Wuthering Heights, actually. That kind of image of the kind of Kathy Heathcliff,
I could even
cemetery.
See this as a first time reader, not like, at least just hitting the beginning of that paragraph, not realizing that are these ghostly figures? So and they passed around the church, and she thinks they're gonna, this is like a setup for a ghost story. They passed around the back of the church. I thought they were going to come in the side, and then suddenly you would find out it's a ghost later.
What's interesting here is she kind of, the way she frames it as I noticed them is kind of undermining the fact that they're there and waiting. They know exactly what's going to happen. They've gone to the church to stop it because they somewhere believe that he is going to go through with this, because they're not gone straight to Thornfield, have they? They've gone, at this moment, at this time, we're going to have to stop it because he will go through with this, or he will try.
That's interesting that they're now, they don't send a letter. They don't go to the house. They just go right to the church in order to have
and they don't stop him on this walk in, do they? They're not saying, oh, look, we need to stop you before you go in the church. They're going to slip in the side and wait until the thing gets going.
And do it at the dramatic moment.
Yeah. And of course, there's all that, imagery there of death going on, isn't there? The way that Jane describes herself, with her forehead dewy and her lips and cheek being cold. It's dark imagery, dark Gothic imagery.
It is, but she rallies and they head in. She sees the strangers in there. They're and this is an odd bit here. I'm just wondering your take on this, because we suddenly get a little bit of Rochester family history here, which I find unusual. Because they're looking at the tombs. And there's a kneeling angel guarded the remains of Damer de Rochester, slain at Marston Moor in the time of the Civil Wars, and of Elizabeth, his wife. What do you get from this bit of Rochester family history here? This is an odd detail to throw in at this moment, I think.
It definitely is. I mean, the fact that it's drawing attention to death and a married couple, I think it obviously it's going to speak to what we know is about to happen. But the fact that it's locating, I guess, the present in this troubled past, that this is, his ancestor fell.
Makes it very more Gothic. It's that, and
he's about to do the same, right? It's history kind of repeating itself symbolically. Charlotte's really hammed it up here, isn't she, in that sense?
And he was, and apparently, well, it was on the losing side in that Civil War. Obviously, it seems as if he was probably, a cavalier. And now Rochester is sinning, going against. There's a different kind of Civil War going on now. Oh, it is too. It's like there's a Civil War going on in that house.
and in his head and in his heart. I guess the other thing here is that connection between, husband and wife, the whole anticipating the marriage vows, the death till they part, that kind of thing that's going on here. That's kind of, it links back to that imagery of death that Jane's had in that previous paragraph. So lots of Gothic overtones going on. Also, there's no point is she picking up, that I guess all of the kind of that she's standing in her dress and her wedding dress, and she's sweating, she's cold, she's not kind of saying, can I have a moment here? It's just everything is happening around her in lots of ways, which I find really interesting, because she kind of becomes so passive from the minute she walks to the church. She's just dragged around the whole time, everything's happening to her.
But she's at least seeing what's going on around her. Rochester's not. He's just firmly single-minded. He's just moving forward, not looking around. He doesn't see them. He doesn't see them come up. One of them, that's the lawyer, coming up behind as they approach the altar. Yeah. And then we get the moment that we all, and Jane even comments here, like at this moment in every wedding ceremony, I require and charge you both, as ye will answer at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed. My wife and I didn't have that in our wedding service. That if either of you know any impediment why ye may not lawfully be joined together in matrimony, ye do now confess it. For be ye well assured that so many as are coupled together otherwise than God's word doth allow are not joined together by God, neither is their matrimony lawful. And Jane even comments, like, he paused the custom, like, when is the pause after that sentence ever broken by reply? Perhaps once. And I've every wedding I've ever been to, when they say that, it's always like looking around at, like, in a joking way, like, is somebody going to say something now? Like, really? You're at the altar now, there's going to be an impediment?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, by giving us that full language here, it is making it clear that someone has to confess if there's an issue, because they won't be married otherwise. She's really spelling it out for us, I think.
I'm going to put this out there for the audience, because this has happened in books and it's happened in movies where somebody does object, there's an impediment. But I wonder, has anybody ever seen or this in person? I wonder if anybody's ever experienced this moment. Tragic, clearly, for a bride and groom, but I'd love to have details of somebody that's actually had that happen. And
hopefully they don't have the surname Rochester.
Yes. So the marriage can't go on. I declare the existence of an impediment, and Rochester's just, proceed. Like, just ignores what's going on behind him. And what would she say? Rochester moves slightly, as if an earthquake had rolled under his feet, and he just, like, this is it. He thought he had it all set up. Yeah. And
I love that phrase. I'm kind of obsessed with every time you get the phrase "as if" in literature, because it's so subjective on the part of whoever's saying it about whatever the context is. As if an earthquake had rolled under his feet. So, but that again, the idea that the denial is so paramount here, isn't it? He is not going to acknowledge, despite this earthquake beneath his feet. I mean, it's quite such a strong piece of language, but the word, he just says proceed, despite the impediment being announced in some way.
I'm trying to look up how many times "as if" occurs, and I'm not finding it here. So I wonder how many times as if occurs in this novel. As if maybe 111 times. So
and that would make sense, because this is Jane's retrospective writing, isn't it? It's her autobiography, so she's making the connections, she's drawing out the metaphors and the similes and all of those things.
A lot. 111 times in this book she's taking us down that road, that metaphoric road. Go ahead.
What's interesting here is, of course, she uses that as if the earthquake, and you imagine an earthquake would be absolutely loud. But then the next line is profound silence fell when he had uttered that word after proceed. So it's kind of, him drowning out the noise of this kind of shattering truth that's kind of, been put before him in lots of ways.
Well, she says, Rochester heard, but he did not. It's got her hand and it's hot and a strong grasp. His eyes are shining, still watchful and yet wild beneath. He just wants it to go on. And of course the clergyman says, no, we have to, we have to explore this. And now, and I love the slow way that things get unveiled here too, especially for first-time readers, and first-time readers who don't know the story, haven't seen the movies, don't know that he's married and who Bertha is and all that. She's had this great build-up for 3 chapters now that the mystery is going to get revealed, and she's really taken her time with it. Charlotte Brontë, the author, has really taken her time with revealing this, and even in the moment, it's just pieced together with there's an impediment, and then a few paragraphs later in some conversation, it's a previous marriage, and then he's actually still married. It goes on here in a way that really ratchets up the suspense especially for a first-time reader.
And I guess from in a way what that does is it puts us in Jane's shoes, because the day becomes like a death by 1,000 cuts, doesn't it? Because it's that slow, as you said, unveiling, which is probably a terrible pun for a wedding chapter, but that's going on, isn't it? So
she's read her reaction there. My nerves vibrated.
My nerves vibrated to those low-spoken words as they had never vibrated to thunder. My blood felt their subtle violence as it had never felt frost or fire. But I was collected and in no danger of swooning.
That's very Janeian.
Absolutely. I love that phrase, subtle violence. It seems like a massive understatement to me. So with no danger of swooning, I looked at Mr. Rochester. I made him look at me. His whole face was colourless rock. His eye was both spark and flint. He disavowed nothing. He seemed as if he would defy all things. Without speaking, without smiling, without seeming to recognise in me a human being, he only twinned my waist with his arm and riveted me to his side.
Yeah. I love I made him look at me, because we've gotten this from Jane and from Rochester too. He acknowledges that she has some kind of power over him that he can't quite understand. How could anyone have power over me? And she does. And also that she's going to reassure us, the reader, but herself, that I'm not going to behave in a way that's that's weak. I'm not going to swoon. I'm going to handle this situation as it needs to be handled. This is very Jane.
Yeah. And it's interesting, of course, when we go back to earlier in the chapter and she'd come down the stairs and he forces that short breakfast on her, and we drew attention to that gaze when he talks about her fair as a lily and all of those things, and he's kind of talks about her, desire in her. This is then the very different reversal of dynamic. She's now forcing him to look at her because he clearly doesn't want to. It's such a different dynamic that's opened up here. And of course, she becomes the active agent. She's not the passive person that's been dragged to the church anymore. She's kind of asserting her presence, but very subtly still. And you've got to feel sorry for her here, haven't you? Because she's gone into shock, effectively, as we're going to kind of see unfold.
And without seeming to recognize in me a human being. This will continue now for the rest of the chapter, where she's not Jane anymore. She's this kind of thing that he talks about And we'll see that through the rest of
absolutely
this chapter. And she recognizes it right away.
Yeah.
Well, here we get the Mr. Briggs takes out the document. I affirm and can prove that on the 20th of October AD, a date of 15 years back, Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall in the county of Ferndean Manor in Blankshire, England, was married to my sister Bertha Antoinetta Mason, daughter of Jonas Mason, merchant, and Antoinetta, his wife, a Creole, at a church in Spanish Town, Jamaica. The record of the marriage will be found in the register of the church. A copy of it is now in my possession, signed Richard Mason. So big secret. There it is, revealed in an official document too. So which I like a lot.
One of the things I think that's really shocking about this is that she draws the attention to the date, a date of 15 years back. And again, it's one of those moments where I wonder, is that brackets, a date of 15 years back, is that Jane retrospectively drawing attention to just how long it had been? Or is that part of the dialogue?
See, I had just assumed that it's the narrator throwing that in there, which is interesting. Because
you wouldn't, would you? You wouldn't. You would say, they got married in 1827. You wouldn't have to then say as an aside, that was 15 years ago, by the way. But I guess drawing attention to that date, it kind of really reaffirms, or we suddenly get a sense of how long Rochester's had to live with this situation. And he's been kind of holding that in. But I mean, I don't know if some of the listeners here have thoughts on that date of 15 years back and that use of brackets there.
And then I like how it plays out here because it's Rochester and how it plays out, especially for an OI reader, and that Rochester's still like, but that doesn't mean she's still alive, and you still have to think, oh, maybe she's not, and then you have to go through this. She was living 3 months ago. The witness, and now Rochester's really like, produce him or go to hell. I mean, he's just like, he's in it, and he has to be reminded, not this moment, but at another moment, like, hey, you're in church.
Yeah. Again, that's quite shocking in terms of his conduct. And he does know.
1847,
absolutely.
You don't tell somebody to go to hell in church.
And given that we've been given, the long kind of, you're going to be judged by God if you don't declare the impediment and all of those things by now. He's really been, Jane's already called him stubborn, but wow, he's really
he doesn't operate by other people's rules.
Yeah,
he is, a force unto himself. Very much what we've frequently seen in literature about his class. He's the law. Nobody else can tell him what to do.
I mean, even just those few lines earlier when he says that if a genuine document, after that information has been read, if a genuine document, I mean, he's trying to cast doubt on it, I think, because he knows it's a genuine document. So it's such an interesting, again, insight into just kind of the emotional state he's built himself into, and the length at which he's willing to go on this day. It's frightening, actually.
All right. Well, before we get into him confronting Mason here, let me give my little mid-break message for everyone and let you all know that we bring Sundays with Jane Eyre to you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do so at our website. And since this novel was published in 1847, we're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show. Donations go directly toward keeping this show free and accessible to everyone. And I want to thank Ann R. from Avon, Indiana, who gave a donation this week. You could also become a member of the Rosenbach, and Cassandra A. From Philadelphia, and Rosalind B. from Honeybrook, PA, also became members this week. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs, plus 10% off of any of our reading courses. I should give them a sneak Brontë reading course coming up, and maybe I will later. 50% off of any Rosenbach programs. Lots of programs and courses coming up. The winter programs and courses are online. You can check. There's still more courses to sign up for. We just finished the spring program and course schedule, which will be published in like another month, but maybe I'll give a preview of something that's coming up today. Was also Sundays with Jane Eyre merchandise, including these mugs and t-shirts with these great logos that we had created by Anohea Ramsey. Get them while supplies last. We have an official bookseller for Sundays with Jane Eyre, a novel idea on Passyunk in Philadelphia, where you can buy editions of Jane Eyre and other books featured on this show. Perhaps when the Emily Brontë Reappraised comes out in the American edition, you can buy it through Novel ID on Passyunk. You buy online through their site, and also upcoming co-hosts. We have a great February continued for you after today. Next week, the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going will return. We all love them. And then on February 20th, Dr. Kathleen Hudson will come back. And then on February 27th, Rowan Coleman, is going to join us. She writes the Brontë Mystery Series under the name Bella Ellis. And I'm very excited to have Rowan Coleman on the show at the end of the month. Let us return to the book. I hinted at a course that will be coming up, and it will be a course on the Brontës, in which, except for, well, it'll be 3 novels, not including, and we won't include Jane Eyre in it, and it will be taught by Claire O'Callaghan and Sophie Franklin and Adele Hayes, each of them choosing a novel from the Brontë author that they have written a biography of, and you'll be doing Wuthering Heights, correct?
Yeah. It's her only novel. It's the only one I can choose.
It's the only one you can choose. So, and Adele will be doing The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and Sophie Franklin will be doing Villette. That is not available to register for yet. That is a total sneak preview announcement for you people watching the show, coming up later in the spring, and it'll be 3. It'll be Claire, Sophie, and Adele, each teaching one class by themselves on that novel, and then the 3 of them together for a final class to bring it all together on the Brontës. And it'll obviously be virtual. So
yeah,
I can't wait. I can't wait for that course.
We're really looking forward to that. Yeah, we're really looking forward to it. So we hope so many people will come along.
Details soon on the Rosenbach website, and obviously by the time the show ends, it'll be available to register, and we can talk about it lots then. All righty. So now Mason's finally, going to step forward, quite, afraid to, and why wouldn't he be afraid to step forward to Rochester, who easily, beat up anybody in the room, it seems. He's now furious. Jane notices the spasmodic movement of fury or despair run through his frame. I mean, it's all crumbled away. If Mason's there, it's done. Like, this is the final piece. He's trying to hold it back, but Mason's there, and there's nothing he can do. I love this description of Rochester. Jane says he turned and glared at him. His eye, as I have often said, was a black eye. It had now a tawny, nay, a bloody light in its gloom, and his face flushed. Olive cheek and hueless forehead received the glow as from spreading, ascending heart fire.
It's almost like Heathcliff, isn't it? You get that.
It is.
Going on.
The last chapter, there were moments in the last chapter of this novel that I felt like if you pulled them out and just read them to somebody, they might guess that it's Wuthering Heights.
Yeah.
And we get a lot of that here. I mean, it's he's quite clearly in that Byronic, hero kind of mold, but even fiercer and I think more dangerous in a way.
Yeah.
At least he's described as by Charlotte.
There's a really interesting, after that description of his eye, and Jane goes on and says, and he stirred, lifted his strong arm, he could have struck Mason.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that she says that he could have struck Mason, not he does or he doesn't struck Mason, but there's a couple of moments later where again it's that there's a threat of him. He could do this. He could be violent going on, in terms of physical violence. There's that sense that this is a man that's suddenly really changed and has held it together, but now is
as we've kind of said, it's all been revealed, and now we're seeing true him in lots of ways.
Yeah. And this is his last, chance to like quash this, secret, and he's trying to get Mason to back down. What have you to say? As if maybe he would just say, "Oh, no, forget it, I lied," and turn around and walk out, which is a possibility. If he's that afraid of Rochester, he might back off here. But that's it. She's, and here's where he says the devil is in it if you cannot answer distinctly. Here's where the clergyman is like, all right, that's enough. That's enough of going to hell and the devil in church.
Yeah.
And Mason finally, she's living at Thornfield Hall. I was there last April. I am her brother. And this is the moment where we don't get a chain reaction yet. But for me, this is the moment where it's like, it all must hit her, everything that's, because she's extraordinarily, and she's proven she's extraordinarily sharp at putting the pieces together as she knows them.
Yeah.
And this all must just fall into place for her now at this moment.
Particularly with these next words, I think,
Well, first we get the clergyman interrupts. He's like, I never heard of a Mrs. Rochester. And Rochester is, I took care nobody should hear of her. And then boom, he lets it all out finally.
One of the things that always, it strikes me here, but whenever I've taught this book, and again, we were talking earlier about people reading this for the first time, is so many of the people that when I've taught this for those first time readers, it's that grim smile that contorts his face. They're all troubled by that. It's such an image that contorts his lip. So menacing in so many ways. And those words, he muttered, "No, by God, I took care that none should hear of it or of her under that name." Wow, what a declaration to make. That is the true colors moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and that it's like it's a sardonic, smile attitude that he has to the rest of this chapter.
Yeah,
he is just ruthless and brutal in the way he talks about Bertha and himself, and even Jane in a way, through the rest of this. That he's, and I guess it's the moment of despair for him too. It's fury and despair together, and what else does he have to live for now? This is just, everything has crumbled to the earth.
And that moment, then, when he says, the clergyman said, "I've not heard of a Mrs. Rochester," but he says, "I took care none should hear of it." That dehumanizing going on there, which again is very, very Wuthering Heights in so many ways. Yeah. But it goes back to the earlier comment that Jane made about drawing attention to him kind of with the human being, not recognized as a human being kind of comment. So instructive. But then the next line, it confuses me even more. He mused for 10 minutes. He held counsel with himself. He formed his resolve and announced it.
That's interesting. I hadn't caught that. So then they all stand there for 10 minutes.
Yeah, everyone's looking at each other, obviously, at the is he talking
to himself?
It's a long time, isn't it?
Looking at each other. I didn't even catch that.
Yeah. We could have listened to the full rendition of Light My Fire and something else at that point, that he's doing that.
That has got to be the most awkward 10 minutes in history. Everyone just staring at each other, waiting for him to continue. And then he lets out with it. And just he lets out with like talking about bigamy is an ugly word. I meant, however, to be a bigamist. Fate has outmaneuvered me, or Providence has checked me. I am a little better than a devil at this moment. That he begins with that, which is good for him. Finally, like, it's about what I'm doing wrong. Yeah. For someone in denial for so long, to then finally, in the moment of confession, he's not really blaming anyone else. Even that fate thing, it's fate, but more likely Providence. Because that is I'm getting what I deserve. That it's Providence. Fate would be different. Fate would be it's just fate.
Yeah.
But Providence he recognizes immediately.
Absolutely. And when he says, "Gentlemen, my plan is broken up," I think it's really interesting that he's not saying anything to Jane. He's speaking to the men in the room at this point.
Jane's not even there in a sense.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
he'll grab her, pull her along for the rest of this, but he speaks to her in the third person for the rest of this. We'll see. I'm pretty sure he does.
And I like this detail that he draws out when he says, you know, you say you've never heard of a Mrs. Rochester at the house up yonder, Wood, but I dare say you have many a time inclined your ear to gossip about the mysterious lunatic kept there under watch and ward. Some have whispered to you that she is my bastard half-sister, some my cast-off mistress. That's really interesting. So he's known of all the rumors, and you kind of go, has he started them? You know, where have they come from? You know, there have been all this stuff going on, and he is just, that's why he's fled. It kind of makes sense. He's kind of got away from the trouble in lots of ways.
And this is something that we have been, you know, like we wrestle with, because even now in this reading of it in the early chapters, a question that kept coming up between people with read it even were like, wait, doesn't Mrs. Fairfax know who it is? And we had finally realized at one point, and here's the confirmation of it, that it is only he and Grace Poole that know she is his wife. Everyone else has never been told that. And so they just kind of guess who she might be. Yeah. And these guesses make sense, especially that she would have been, you know, some former mistress of himself. And maybe even Adele, like maybe people thought it was Adele's mother, you know, like a mistress and he had Adele with, and now she's mad. And that would have made sense in the gossip realm, and they're trying to figure it out without knowing the story.
Yeah. But then his tone changes when he kind of, you know, he says about, you know, he confirms Bertha. But then when he kind of says, you know, cheer up, Dick, never fear me, I'd almost as soon strike a woman as you. Such a kind of defiant tone. You kind of think, wow, that's so brazen at this point. And of course.
And really treating, you know, Mason as, you know, beneath him too.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was going to say. And using that kind of, you know, that shortened version of his name. And
she's also here, you know, and through the rest of it, he never calls her Bertha Rochester.
Yeah.
She's always Bertha Mason.
Yeah.
He doesn't accept that she's even married, that he's married to her anymore. And then he tells him she's mad. She came of a mad family, idiots and maniacs through 3 generations. Her mother, the Creole, which we'll talk about too, was both a mad woman and a drunkard, as I found out after I had wed the daughter, for they were silent on family secrets before. So we get all kinds of things here that he has talked about, and that also I think have far different connotations in the 19th century for people. And so I want to see if we can, you know, talk about a few of these things, like what it's like to be a mad family and idiots, as he calls them, and the fear of mental illness running through generations. Creole, obviously, that's a big term here we need to talk about. Yeah, and the drunkard too, the alcoholism as a moral failing, you know, that also gets passed down through.
Yeah. I mean, I think in context, one of the things we need to see here is, as you've said, that he's given us he's given multiple reasons here for this person, why they are as they are, you know, why they are mad. You know, he's drawing on this idea that there's a hereditary thing going on in the family, which was a big belief at the time. But he's also indicating, you know, this idea of idiots. You know, idiocy was again perceived as a form of madness in the 19th century. But this idea that she's a drunkard, which is more of a moral issue and a form of moral madness. So he's throwing every kind of reason that kind of 19th century society and culture would have understood as the different causes of madness at the time. You know, this is, you know, not sophisticated by contemporary, you know, conceptions and insights into what causes any kind of issue around mental health. But he's given us everything here. And of course, drawing attention to her race with this idea of that she's Creole.
Now, we'll find, you know, like several editions in the notes, they always seem to talk about this. No one seems to be quite sure if by Creole, Charlotte Brontë means that is a mixed race term, or it is just a term meaning anybody, including people who are only kind of European descent, but they are living and born in the West Indies. We still never get the confirmation of this all throughout this book, specifically that she's talking about a racial makeup, but for me it doesn't even matter because it's still that othering of Creole. It's that even if you're only of European descent, you're still something else now because you're from the West Indies, right?
Yeah, definitely. And this is loaded language. This is in a colonial context. This is her understanding what those kind of overtones about racial othering and kind of the legacies of empire, really, what that would mean in constructing this character. And of course, it's no coincidence that the darkness and the purple and the all of the imagery that's associated with Bertha is kind of, on the one hand, very savage, playing on those ideas here, but also setting in parallel or in opposition to Jane being this fair lily, this kind of almost an English rose in lots of ways. I mean, so it's kind of complicated.
This is as savage as any Joseph Conrad novel, this kind of view of colonialism, without Charlotte Brontë even being aware that she's pointing out this. It is this is that colonial worldview where the natives are dangerous and corrupting and destroy us in insidious ways through marriage, through having children, through letting bloodlines continue through this.
And let's be clear that Rochester is here, from this very moment is making himself, again, he sets himself up a little bit as a victim of decisions that have been made for him, the organized marriage that we come to find out that's taken place. And again, that's playing on these ideas, and it's this very complex idea about innocence and savagery and civilization and all of those things that go with all of that. Incredibly loaded. The
blame is all on them. They've tricked him into this marriage. And that's the plot, though, that Charlotte Brontë is setting up here too. That I think that we're supposed to realize that in the end or something, certainly he's made mistakes and it's just not but it's also at the root of it kind of wasn't his fault because he was tricked into it. And that's a little unsettling to realize that that's the viewpoint that's being portrayed here in this book.
The other thing that's going on here, this is before in Victorian legislation, divorce was more fully enshrined. It comes about in 1857. Before this point, by the fact that Bertha is as we find out, later in the book, that she has been designated mad by two doctors, Rochester can't divorce her anyway. That was enshrined in law. He has to live with her, irrespective. So in a way, it kind of gives some context as well for why he's either gone into flight mode off into Europe and spent time having affairs elsewhere, and he's kept her at Thornfield Hall because he can't leave her in any other way. Really complicated.
I've had this question from people too, that especially first time, like, well, why doesn't he divorce her at any point? But that's not even an option.
Not an option of him.
He's he perhaps is, if he was rich enough and had enough political connections, because it requires an act of parliament that he ever pushed through, but it's usually just lords who are able to escape a marriage.
And like I said,
not at that level.
That medical diagnosis makes it impossible for him to do that. So it's kind of it's really interesting, I guess. What's kind of sad though is the fact that then we see when he kind of is, he does use the phrase "my wife" the whole time, but of course we can see really reading between his words that he's disassociated himself from that. She's this othered thing. So he has such a complex. He clearly feels in a complex situation.
Every time he says "my wife," he's being mocking about it. That he was cheated into espousing, but then it's also judge whether or not I had a right to break the compact. And this is his point through the rest of this chapter is don't judge me because this is the situation I was stuck with. And dude, we're gonna judge you.
Exactly.
Because you did something wrong. So we still have to judge you, but that's what he's really focused on. And then again, here's what it is with Jane is this girl, he continued looking at me, knew no more than you, like third person. She's not part of it, but at least he exonerates her. but it's she doesn't know what's going on, and it's this girl, and he calls her he calls
Bertha
a mad and embruted partner. I can't think of mad, bad, and dangerous to know about Byron.
That's exactly it. It's all of the things. And again, it places the blame for who Bertha is. It's her. It's not him. It's not that he's done anything wrong. It's all because she's mad, bad, and embruted. It comes from her.
I know that mad, bad, and dangerous to know was a phrase people did know about Lord Byron. Although how prevalent it was, and whether Charlotte, I think she would have known that.
I think she absolutely would have known.
And I love how here it's reversed. That Rochester, the Byronic hero, is not mad, bad, and embruted, right? It's her he's talking.
Yeah.
It's Bertha is the bad, mad, and embruted.
And this is where Charlotte's knowledge of 19th century psychiatry really shines through. I mentioned earlier, she was reading 19th century medical writing. She was reading the work of James Cal Pritchard on moral madness. And she talks about that in her letters. And his idea of moral madness is playing around these ideas of badness and madness. Because if someone's just bad, then it makes them have a moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they're truly insane and they're not culpable for their behaviors, it exonerates them. Rochester's having it both ways here. Bertha is bad and mad, and both at the same time. So complicated.
Yeah, and also in a kind of worldview where still, madness is kind of if God made you mad, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
That it is a kind of representation of a sin kind of thing. The clergyman towards the end of the chapter hints at this with Jane kind of thing too. That she's I don't know. We'll get to that later. But that's still the worldview here too. That if you're insane, it's one of the reasons people don't have to be compassionate towards the insane is God has chosen something to be wrong with them.
Yeah.
And so they can easily push them off and cast them off and not be concerned with them.
Definitely.
All right, now he grabs Jane. He's like, let's go back to the house.
We're going to march back to the house now.
I love how everyone's standing in there when he comes in and advance to meet and greet. Like they're all like about to say, congratulations.
Throw the thing.
To the right about every soul, away with your congratulations, 15 years too late. They march upstairs through the room with the we get a reminder of that pictorial cabinet again. If everybody remember, that's all the apostles on it.
This description. I think this is what's most frightening to me. This is such a kind of
go ahead, read it.
A Freudian walk. So we're told he passed on and ascended the stairs, still holding my hand and still beckoning the gentlemen to follow him, which they did. We mounted the first staircase, passed up the gallery, proceeded to the third story. The low black door opened by Mr. Rochester's master key admitted us to the tapestried room with its great bed and its pictorial cabinet. And then, this place, Mason, said our guide. She bit and stabbed you here. But then he lifted the hangings from the wall, uncovering the second door. This too he opened. In a room without a window, there burnt a fire guarded by a high and strong fender and a lamp suspended from the ceiling by a chain. I mean, let's just talk about this. He has put her in a room with no windows, and it's got enclosed by two doors and hidden by tapestries. I mean, it couldn't be any more a symbol of repression in any other way. She's doubly locked away. Mm-hmm. And I think that idea that he's he said it already, didn't he? He'd concocted a plan to marry Jane, but he also clearly had concocted a plan to put his wife in a windowless room. That's worse than any conditions for any 19th century lunatic. Mm-hmm. Even if they had been shackled in private or public asylums at the time, a windowless room is, I think, really, really frightening.
He's concealing not just the mad person, but he's concealing his guilt, his mistake, the things that he has done wrong. He needs to hide them from the world. And I love the twist here that it's Bluebeard himself who reveals the secret room, with his key, with his master key. This is something that, is supposed to be found out, but no, Bluebeard himself is revealing it here with a great twist on that kind of story that clearly Charlotte Bronte's aware of. She even refers to Bluebeard by name earlier.
Yeah.
And then the very, again, weird fairy tale like world that we look at. Grace Poole bent over the fire, apparently cooking something in a saucepan. Like I can just picture her look like it's a very much like a witch at the cauldron. We've already had Macbeth references in this. This weird thing here. Now read the description for us in the deep shade.
So in the deep shade at the further end of the room, a figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It grovelled, seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal, but it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. When you think about those kind of, she's almost like a Nebuchadnezzar figure almost here. And Charlotte has done that classic thing of that's so common, I think, in references or images, textual or visual, of the mad at the time, which is to anthropomorphize them, make it an animal, reduce the individual from being a human being to being far more animalistic.
It snatched it, like all through. They're very much dehumanized. And that madness as portrayed as an animal, which is then also a kind of, we're still pre-Darwin here, but still the ideas that you'd become savage, you become more connected to the animal world than the human civilized one.
I think that use of it and that repetition, again, it also reminds me very much of Wuthering Heights. It's exactly the same language that gets attributed to Heathcliff when he's first brought there and described as it over and over again. I think something like 37 times in that chapter that he's described when he first
brought
arrived
in as the child.
Yeah. And they're talking about it. And again, there's just that connection here of this dehumanized, wild, savage individual. And I guess, when you think about it, the different perspectives here that Bertha is not a human anymore. She's reduced to being an animal. And of course, Jane is seeing Mrs. Rochester for the first time. It's not a human being as far as
second time.
Seeing.
Second time.
Yeah, of course.
But she didn't know she saw her then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And then Mrs. Poole here, and Rochester asks, how's your charge today? Rather snappish, but not rageous. And for Jane too, now she sees Grace Poole. First, she just assumed that Grace Poole was this crazy woman who was drunk and who would light Rochester's bed on fire and try to murder Mason. For Jane to still be in the house, like every time she sees Grace Poole, it's got to be like this moment of terror, like, oh my gosh, this is like, I don't understand why you're here, because Rochester has let her believe that it's her too.
In the same way that he's let those rumors about who's in the Thornfield Hall, was it the mysterious rumors that he's let fly? He's kind of accustomed to doing that, is what we're seeing.
And so Grace Poole here now, we finally see her, and especially for first time readers, see like who she is, what she's doing, and this changes obviously the conception that Jane and the reader has had of her position in this house, that she's just the one person who is in charge with controlling this, this mad woman who is also very violent and sometimes breaks out. But she's also, talk about the moral failings of being, of alcoholism. This is Grace Poole's problem.
Well, yeah, exactly. There's a kind of hypocrisy going on here, isn't it? She's not done a great job if her charge is breaking out and running around the house starting fires. And
this is the stereotype of the nurse too, in this kind of private nurse hired in the Victorian age. And Dickens does this and creates a great comic character, Mrs. Gamp, over this. But this is a common conception that these women you would hire as nurses were low class and drunks, and that's why they have to do this. And of course, most of them likely were not, but this is the conception people have, and it's Charlotte using this kind of caricature figure for her in this as well. But
and also you've got to think about, I mean, if Bertha's been locked in a windowless room behind 2 doors and a whole load of tapestries, it's not really a great job for Grace, also stuck.
So is she most
conditions.
of the time. Yeah.
Like
she just has to sit in this room 90% of her time.
Yeah, basically.
And take care of her.
Makes you wonder how much she's been paid, right? Or what the job description said.
She's making coin here. They said it earlier in the other chat. They said the amount that she makes is like, wow.
Yeah.
So the other servants, so that's why she gets paid so much. Grace is going to retire at some point, and other servants are not. They're going to stay in service the rest of their life. Grace is going to get to retire at some point with the money she's making. Again, it's more animal. The clothed hyena, and now it's specific. The clothed hyena rose up and stood tall on its hind feet. Zero humanity there. Yeah, and the fact that it's clothed makes it even stranger, because you're looking at as this kind of clothed animal stand up, and Grace has the warning, sir, she sees you, you'd better not stay. So
I think that's really instructive.
Hinting that Bertha is more dangerous for Rochester than anyone else. Right. Yeah.
Which, if we think about this, I guess, I know when the text isn't constructed with kind of seeing this from Bertha's point of view, but what that's kind of, I guess, telling us is that Bertha is absolutely triggered specifically by the sight of Rochester. There's something when she sees him, sets off that level of violence. It's not that she has the same violence just purely by seeing Jane, because she could have really harmed her when she'd been breaking into the room and doing this, all the other things she's been doing. It's very, very localized to her husband, and you can't blame her, really. Been put in a windowless room.
We have a question from Nikki here. She asked that if Charlotte was reading medical text, what did she think or mean to imply was wrong with Bertha to make her so physically hideous in her madness? That physical transformation is also happens here with mad people. And that's a very 19th century belief, isn't it?
It definitely is. And I guess this is one of the ambiguities, I think, of the text, is we find out that ultimately Bertha has been in this room for 11 years. She's been in a windowless room for 11 years. So Charlotte is actually not quite clear whether by the time she came to England with Rochester, she had already so changed that she was looking as she does now, or if actually her madness has been made worse by those conditions. And I guess, for all of us, I think we talked about this very briefly the other day, this idea that, we've all just gone through COVID and through lockdowns and things like that. The need to get outside and to access and live a kind of normal life under enormous strain has never been more kind of, I guess, foregrounded to us. So you kind of have some context for why Bertha looks the way she does if she's been kept in those conditions. She's basically been imprisoned. Yeah. But at the same time, 19th century writing does also draw on some images of animals, I guess, in its descriptions of the mad. But it also has a kind of racial overtones. Those ideas of darkness and savagery as very loaded in the kind of medical writing that Charlotte was looking at.
She's also cunning, which makes her also evil in a sense. She's so cunning, and then she attacks. She attacks Rochester, and they wrestle. She tries to. She actually bites his cheek. Yeah. And she's so big that it's not, he can't just push her aside easily. Again, he could have hit her. He would not strike.
And why is Jane doing it? It's the second time she's done that in this chapter. He could have, with Mason earlier, but he didn't.
Could have just knocked her out, but he doesn't. As if oh, well, okay, let's now I'm on his side.
Yeah. I think the lines that go on here, again, if we start to read between them, though, it's kind of disturbing that ppassage where it goes on. So he could
have settled her with a well-planted blow, but he would not strike. He would only wrestle. At last he mastered her arms. Grace Poole gave him a cord, and he pinioned them behind her. With more rope, which was at hand, he bound her to a chair. The operation was performed amidst the fiercest yells and the most convulsive plunges. That tells us something. There's already rope in that room, and he knows how to tie her up. You know, this was a time in which debates about restraint, particularly with those who were diagnosed as mad, was being had in society and culture. There was the great move to take away restraints, to not shackle people, to not tie them up. It was a time that there was far more humane reforms going on. That little detail, though, kind of suggests that that's been happening all this time, that she is accustomed to, or not she's accustomed to being tied up, but that Grace and Rochester have done that before, because they've already got the equipment there, and he clearly knows how to do it. He does it really easily. She really points that out.
And there's and I'm not, and you're right. We've throughout the 19th century we see there's lots of doctors who were trying to reform the way we treat mad people or people with mental disease, and that is changing over the century, but it takes a lot. And you could say that we still deal with the same issues. The way we set up institutions for the mentally ill, and when in fact we just kind of incarcerate them in a sense.
And what's interesting as well is the fact that the kind of moral madness, as it was called, that Charlotte's reading about, that she recreates here through Bertha, the forms of treatment at the time were not forms of restraint. They are more about the belief that if you showed somebody good moral behaviours, if you gave them exercise, if you fed them well, and you kind of showed them kind of more religious ideals, they would come to their senses. That's written about all the time in the period. So in a way, Rochester's approach to treating his wife is totally antithetical to the kind of treatments he could have had open to him with her. He's gone for the one that gives him the path of least resistance, which is put her in a windowless room and go to Europe. I don't have to see her then. So it's all about him. And I think there's a really interesting question, therefore, going back to that thing about how she looks. To what extent all of this has made her so much worse? Is that why she attacks him? Because she knows that he's just abandoned her, left her in that room, in a windowless room.
Mm-hmm. Janet asks, does Charlotte, the author, mean to portray Bertha simply as dangerous? And of course, is Rochester ever questioned in his need to imprison Bertha?
Mm-hmm. He wouldn't have had to. He would have been completely justified according to the kind of laws of the day. I mean, she's property. As soon as he marries her, the laws of the time mean he can do with her what he wants, which exactly what he does. Of course, a man of his means, though, you have to say, given that he goes off traveling, given how much money he has, he could have chose something else. He could have put her in a private madhouse. He didn't have to lock her in the third-story room behind the tapestries and the double door without a window. So there's something very calculating. I think it goes back to that line that he says, he talks about the plan, which I know is more about the immediate bigamy, but it's a longer-term plan for him.
And I don't find anything in the text that doesn't justify his behavior. I think the way Charlotte Brontë portrays her leads, it kind of leads the reader to say, well, of course he should lock her up because she's dangerous and she's that insane now. But I think as I don't know if it's just a modern reader or because I don't know of any 19th century critics of this novel that really address that. I think they don't address it at all, and that silence maybe is complicity from the 19th century that people didn't write about. People didn't think anything of it. Well, if she's insane and acting that way, of course you would, lock her up.
And he's the one with the authority. His voice matters. Particularly, I guess, if we put it back into when we were talking earlier about her being a Creole and the way that language is used. He's the English gentleman, isn't he? He's the privileged English gentleman in a time when English gentlemen had huge amounts of power, and he's kind of shown that here. He can do what he wants,
and people still like that idea of those. I mean, people love Downton Abbey. People love the idea of those people up there being very, benevolent, overlords.
Yeah.
Okay. Christine had a question here. Any comments about Rochester referring to Bertha as a goblin or vampire, even dehumanizing her to it, and Jane as an elf or sprite? Does he call her a vampire, or was that just Jane? I think just
Jane does, but she's of course bit, hasn't she? She's already bit him. So the idea that here she is, she's been likened to that kind of gothic figure. So yeah, I mean, he's again.
There is that parallel, like in how he, dehumanizes Jane in a sense by having all these pet names for her.
Yeah.
And also the same with Bertha.
Yeah. And I guess it adds another kind of, he's just loading all of the reasons, isn't he, really, around to justify his actions, why he's locked her up and why he wanted to marry somebody else. She's a vampire, all these other things. Well, she has actually bit, her brother.
And Jane there are these parallels between Jane and Bertha that, the wearing the veil, both looking in the mirror, Jane being the outsider in this house. And by the end of this chapter, at the very end, I think that there's some things that really link them together as well. But that is my wife. Let's get through the rest of this. And this, like, as referring to Jane, this is what I wish to have, laying his hand on my shoulder. This kind of very much not treating Jane as, she's showcased in here. But this is also this kind of sardonic rage that he's suffering from too. That's consuming him. I don't want to say suffering, like I have some sympathy for him in this moment, because I really don't.
But he then, when he goes on with that kind of, this is what I wish to have, he kind of says that, but then he brings up the whole thing about judgment again. Compared,
judge me.
Judge me, priest of the gospel and man of the Lord. Remember, with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. I mean, that's the Sermon on the Mount. He's kind of comparing himself to Jesus Christ by kind of quoting those words there, which is really complicated, isn't it, in his mind? What is going on in his mind at this point?
And then at the end, he says, off with you now, I must shut up my prize. And I have to wonder who you're talking about. Because you have talked about Jane as a prize, and that this is what you have attained. And so it's really, I'm pretty certain he means Bertha, but it could easily be him, like, now I'm going to go, take my governess that I've won here and put her in her room. And now we get this great revelation of, like, how they all found out. The solicitor tells Jane that your uncle will be glad to hear that you're okay, and she's like, what? And he's apparently now her uncle is the correspondent for the Mason family's business from Jamaica, and which again really ties to the colonial world here, that the money that Jane Eyre's uncle makes is tied to probably a slave plantation business in the West Indies. But also that it's when she wrote to her uncle saying, like, oh, I'm going to marry Mr. Rochester, Mason was there because their business connect, and that's what led Jane herself provided the impetus to stop her own marriage unknowingly, of course.
I love the line that when we're told the uncle obviously is sick, the language used is, so he could not then hasten to England himself to extricate you from the snare into which you had fallen. The idea that actually it's a third person, it's an objective or a seemingly objective point of view. They see it as a snare into which, it's a trap, which is so different from being caught as we are here, either bound up in Jane's perspective or just getting Rochester, that somebody else sees it like that as well.
And as they should see it as, Rochester is trying to trick this girl into marrying him when he already has a wife.
And let's be clear, if that had happened, he would have made her a fallen woman. All that stuff about judgment is all absolutely right, but he would have made her equivalent to a fallen woman. She would have been completely ruined. It was a complete trap. He has in a way, he had no care for her reputation by doing that.
Linda had a question here about Rochester not putting Bertha in an institution, and her brother wanted to keep. We're going to hit that next week because then we get more of Rochester talking about the history of what's behind here. So I'm going to talk about that next week, Linda. But your uncle's sick, so he's probably not going to survive. So you just better remain in England until you hear further. And again, these men, they're like, we've saved you for the marriage. Now we're just going to leave you in the house here.
Yeah. This is a lot of shocks for Jane, isn't it? Really, on this day.
Mason, especially, he's like, I'm getting out of here. Like, he is, not portrayed as a character of any kind of strength.
No.
He just wants to leave.
To be fair, he was stabbed here, so you've got to have some understanding for him, I guess, as well.
And I'm sure he's terrified Rochester's going to lay into him as soon as everybody's gone.
Yeah.
And now we get the end of the chapter. We get Jane alone and her processing everything that has happened. The house cleared. I shut myself in. Very interesting language she's using there, just as Bertha was shut in.
Absolutely.
But she's doing it herself. That she is, this is her. She's locking herself up in the red room of her heart. Maybe
absolutely. And it's interesting, of course, she's locking herself up and doing it with kind of agency, and she's not now the new Mrs. Rochester, of course.
Yeah.
Mrs. Rochester didn't have any choice about whether she was locked up. She was just locked up. So there's a really interesting parallel going on, those ideas that they're doubles in some way, or kind of begins to play.
And she still takes pride in that I'm not going to be histrionic here and like, I'm not going to weep, not mourn. I'm too calm. I was yet too calm. Really, Jane? Let it go.
She's in shock, isn't she? She's in shock. But then when she says that, and it's in italics, but now I thought, it's almost like the kind of the reaction, the kind of adrenaline's come down. But as you're right, let it out. I mean,
she's trying to keep it all under control. She's mechanically take off the wedding dress. And now she thinks about what has happened here. And I was in my own room as usual, just myself, without obvious change. Nothing had smitten me or scathed me or maimed me. And yet where was the Jane Eyre of yesterday? Where was her life? Where were her prospects? This is what she needs to figure out now. Where do I go from here?
And in a way, it's sad, that image of her here in the room on her own. And she's saying, nothing scared me and all of these things. It's such a difference to that chapter 2 of Jane Eyre, the child in the red room who was terrified by all of the kind of Gothic and the imagery and all of those things, and the ghosts, and it was traumatized to it. Here, she's far more, she's showing already kind of the signs of maturity. I'm not suggesting that she's got all the answers here at all, but there's that sense of growth in that character, that she's far more reflective as an adult in the moment of trauma than she had been when she was a child on that day, as it's kind of so beautifully described as.
And she recognizes that she's back to where she was, cold, solitary girl again. And then I love this. This is so odd. A Christmas frost had come at midsummer, and I'm thinking, is this really happening? And it's not. I don't. No, this is all metaphor. But she doesn't describe it that way. She describes it as, this is actually happening. The white frost is, the apples are glazed with ice. The flowers are awful. And so it makes it almost kind of hallucinatory for me.
Yeah.
Suddenly the whole world has gone to this kind of desolate winter setting. And very, very well done for me. And even now, encountering it again, I had to question myself at first. Wait, did a frost hit? And no, this is the winter of her soul.
Yeah. It is the kind of language of or the hyperbole of fairy tale, isn't it? And that kind of getting across, exactly, you said, the winter of her soul.
And then she goes even on, right? It's, my hopes were all dead, struck with a subtle doom, such as in one night fell on all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I mean, this is a biblical plague, her desolation here. She's gone that change, isn't she? I know that the idea that she's gone back to being a girl, but she's also not become a woman. She's kind of in the limbo is so multiple levels here for her. read that there. I know we're up against time, but I'm not cutting this chapter off. Finishing in here. I looked at my love. Can you read there? That
where's the I looked at my love? Where I'm lost.
It's in that right after the frost.
Oh, there we go. I looked at my love, that feeling which was my master's, which he had created. It shivered in my heart like a suffering child in a cold cradle. Sickness and anguish had seized it. It could not seek Mr. Rochester's arms. It could not derive warmth from his breast. Oh, never more could it turn to him, for faith was blighted, confidence destroyed. Mr. Rochester was not to me what he had been, for he was not what I had thought him. That's a lot of revelation, isn't it? There, that
is.
point.
I mean, to all that, it's not just myself too that she's thinking I have to think about. Like, it's also him, and everything has changed, not just for me and the actual circumstances that are going on, but who is this person? And she's very honest too about realizing like the love that she has for him is from him. But that's the way we create love. And I mean, it's very much a both of us thing here, but it's all crushed now.
But the next line I'm troubled by, he was not what I had thought him. I would not ascribe vice to him. I would not say he had betrayed me. But the attribute of stainless truth was gone from his idea, and from his presence I must go. That I perceived well. I'm really troubled by why she's not seeing it as he has.
Not the only time she hasn't blamed him for something.
I know. So that it kind of undermines that point I just said about the maturity in some sense, because I guess we could argue in her defense that she's still in shock and she's not maybe able to take in and process everything. But she clearly knows she's got to go.
The end of that paragraph, how blind had been my eyes, how weak my conduct, that she's blaming herself over what has happened, which is absolutely awful and no good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, she still recognizes that I have to go on and live my life. So I have to at least acknowledge, like, I didn't see this stuff. So this is me going forward now. And that part of it, I kind of am okay with. But the blaming herself over this is. But
it's complicated. And also the fact that she, and she's right in a kind of practical sense, she has to go. But there's also another echo of flight there, isn't it? She just wants to get away. These characters keep doing this. They're not learning that's not a great way to process your emotions. And
it's interesting because her youth and even when she first goes to Thornfield, the going away is always this good fantasy with her. It's the thing that I want to do. I want to go off and to be in other places that I don't know and explore them and do. And this is the charm of her getting to go on their honeymoon. She'll get to go to all these places and do this stuff. And now she finally comes to the moment. Actually, no, that I have to go off on my own, and it's banishment. That she doesn't want to go off on her own. Well, of course.
In a way, is kind of deeply troubling and biblical in itself, isn't it? I've got to go off and wrestle on my own with these demons. I need to go and do all this stuff. And she ends, of course, with all of that biblical stuff here.
Yeah, and now it all hits her. Just everything comes flooding in, and that actual metaphor, this torrent comes in and overwhelms her. And she's longing to be dead. And then finally, for this character, I should pray.
Yeah.
And because this is something that would be a strength for this character in her life. And she always, and finally she offers up a prayer, and it's the Psalm, and be not far from me, for trouble is near, there's none to help. That Jane is so alone. She has no more strength left, and so she needs to look outside of herself. And actually, at first she thought about Rochester, right? She doesn't think about God first, because he's her idol now. She thinks about him first. He can't offer me anything anymore. And now she turns and asks God for help, prays, and then but it's like, I don't know, there's no hope at the end of it. It's just now the torrent pours over her. And
to be fair, what a day she's had at this point. It's Charlotte writes that idea of that trauma unfolding and the complexity of this character's
as you said, strength, that there's nothing left. She's only got that kind of religious conviction that she goes to in those times. You know, she's kind of depleted here, but she's still trying to be reflective in some ways.
Yeah.
But it's so you get the sense of the isolation and the loneliness, everything she's been trying to escape from her whole life. She's just come back full circle to in some ways. It's just her in a room on her own again.
And these are, this part here and other times in this novel when Charlotte Brontë, you know, does write about her characters and God and their relationship with God and practicing their religion, they're always so unconventional. And even here too, I mean, for a daughter of a clergyman who is very devout herself, she gives her character great leeway in the way they have a relationship with, you know, their God. Which is I can't assume that it's the way Charlotte thought herself. I can't. I mean, because she's writing a character here, and I have to assume that that's what's going on. But it's unconventional, which I like about
I think that's what's really exciting about a novel like Villette. It's such a complicated book in terms of religion, but in its most, you know, psychological moments, you know, you have Lucy Snow going into a church and you know, Protestant Lucy Snow going into the church and kind of, church, you know, and having, you know, a conversation. Charlotte's really interested in that respect, isn't she? As you said, unconventional with what she's doing.
And no wonder that it really upsets some people at her time, this kind of way that she approaches some of these things. So, well,
as we know, I mean, Jane Eyre, she's famously described as having a heathen mind, wasn't she? And
then she responds in her preface by, like, you know, quoting, you know, all kinds of, you know, biblical, you know, texts, because she knows them all. She's the daughter of a clergyman. She feels like this is the one thing you can challenge me on. But yet I read her novel and I think that she is so unconventional with it that I'm not surprised people challenge her on it.
And what I like about the ending of this chapter, though, is that because it's been so Rochester driven, it's all been about him, you know, him getting to the church, him getting to the honeymoon, him then having to face all his demons. And at the end, we get this return to Jane. It is Jane's autobiography after all. And suddenly she's no longer the passive, you know, spectator of her day. We get a connection with her emotion and how she felt. And I think that's when Charlotte writes really, really well, because we, the reader, have also gone through those shocks, the multiple shocks. Particularly we've read it the first time.
Read that last paragraph and we'll end there.
It was near, and as I had lifted no petition to heaven to avert it, as I had neither joined my hands nor bent my knees nor moved my lips, it came. In full heavy swing, the torrent poured over me. The whole consciousness of my life lorn, my love lost, my hope quenched, my faith death-struck, swayed full and mighty above me in one sullen mass. That bitter hour cannot be described. In truth, the waters came into my soul. I sank in deep mire. I felt no stand-in. I came into deep waters. The floods overflowed me.
And I actually, what I'm noticing now is she doesn't pray. She's almost saying, like, I wanted to pray, but I didn't. And so the torrent poured over me. I mean, in a sense, she's almost like Claudius and Hamlet. Like, it looks like he's praying, but he's not. And in a sense, she sees that in herself. Like, it just took over me. There you go. A very, you know, grim
what a day
ending.
She's had.
To this chapter. So thank you. We went a little long, but this chapter needs it. And it's a short chapter. It
is a short chapter, but there is so much to be said. And do you know what I really like rereading it? I think, and I know I've talked a lot about this, that psychological complexity, but wow, Charlotte does it really well. You really get the intricacies of Rochester. You get the complexity of Bertha and now Jane as well, that emotional, psychological complexity. It's all there. And it's just come to a crescendo. And as you say, it's such a short chapter. Wow, what a twist the novel takes.
It is. Wow. All righty. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic to talk about this chapter with you. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. I've absolutely loved it. Thank you for having me. And I've seen so many great comments. I'm sorry I've not been able to
I'll send you the chat afterwards.
I like the comments about I like the comments about people saying, I'd get back and just rip that dress off rather than slowly take it off. I'm absolutely with you on that.
Early on in other shows that we did, the chat became so busy. That's why I can't follow the chat. That's why I tell people to question Q&A, because like it's so involved, and I love that it is. And I love reading it afterwards.
Yeah.
All righty, Brontë Stores and Airheads, thank you for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website, and it's on our YouTube page. If that's how you're watching it, thank you. We also have a Sundays with Jane Eyre Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. It's always a lot of fun on there. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. Thanks to Steve today, who was our chat Mrs. Fairfax, filling in for our usual Brianna. Thanks so much, Steve, for managing the links in the chat. Next week on episode 20, our friends, the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going, will be back to join us to talk about volume 3, chapter 1, or chapter 27, in which Rochester finally tries to explain. Rochester, you got some splaining to do.
Oh, yeah.
And he and Jane, and then we'll see what Jane does. What's Jane's response? Well, I love her response to it, even though it's sad.
Yeah.
If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out our other virtual offerings and in-person programs that we will soon be having again at the Rosenbach. We're also open to visit, see our website, or we're making it safe for you to come see our exhibitions in historic house in person. And please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. We're asking for donations of $18.47 to support this show, but any donation is welcome. If you feel like, oh, that's a little much, that's fine. So whatever is really awesome. And if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. Claire, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And enjoy the next chapter.
Good. All righty. Well, everyone, playing us out over the credits will be Pleated Gazelle's Secrets. And farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and with what you love best on earth. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.